Most of you are familiar with the saying, the KISS system, keep it simple, stupid. Well, I've already been approached by a couple of congregation members and they've changed it a little bit. It was keep it short, stupid. All of you remember little jingles to encourage you to buy a product or pay attention to a person or situation. Now, I'm not going to sing these because you would all run, but if I say State Farm, the jingle would go, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Or if I mention Mr. Rogers, you would say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Would you be my neighbor? Or, if you're an English major or an English lover of poetry, are you familiar with Robert Frost's poem, Mending Wall? There is a line in the poem that is repeated 3 times. Good fences make good neighbors. Now, why did I use these 3 examples? Neighbor is the key word in today's lesson. In the lesson, there are really 3 parts. There's a lawyer testing Jesus, there is a parable, and there is the question, who is a neighbor? The lawyer wants to know what he must do to inherit eternal life. This lawyer is not a person dealing in secular legal things such as criminal matters, contracts, wills, but he is a scribe, someone who is an expert in Old Testament laws. He would be like a Bible college or a seminary professor. Back to the question he asked. Some biblical analysts say eternal life is a gift we inherit from God through our relationship with Him. It is not something we earn through works of righteousness. But Jesus counters with a question. What is written in the law? And the lawyer says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself, which is taken from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, part of which John read earlier. The lawyer thought he earned eternal life by complying with the law, not through a personal relationship with God. Therefore, he thought he had proven his point to Jesus. Then Jesus told him the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, a parable is a story that teaches a moral or a lesson. The whole story of the Good Samaritan is about defining who your neighbor is. This parable has at least 4, if not 5 characters. The setting is the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, 17 miles. The road is really just a path in places and goes between mountains and makes great places for thieves and bandits to hide. The victim is a Jew that has been beaten and stripped of his clothes. The first person to come upon the victim is a priest. His work would have been in the temple in Jerusalem. He may have been returning to Jericho, the principal residence of priests. In the story, he does nothing to help. He may have thought the man dead, and in Jewish custom, touching a dead body, he would be ritually defiled and could not then go into the temple. Maybe he was afraid that whoever beat up the man might still be around. But the priest stayed on the opposite side of the road and moved on. The second person to come upon the victim is a Levite. Levites are a little lower in hierarchy than priests. They are persons in charge of the day-to-day running of the temple and were responsible for the liturgy in the temple. He may have been in a hurry to open up the temple. Maybe he was also afraid the man who beat up the man was still around. But he does nothing to help the victim and continues on the opposite side of the road. Now remember, both the priest and the Levite are church people and did nothing to help the victim. The next character is the Samaritan, the man for whom the parable is named. A little historical background is needed. Jews despised Samaritans. They were considered traitors and half-breeds. Down through history, there were several instances where Jews and Samaritans were in conflict with each other. Why would Jesus choose a Samaritan rather than a Jew to be the caring person? Remember, the priest and the Levite both walked on the other side of the road from the victim. The Samaritan comes upon the victim and instantly starts first aid. He tends to the man's wounds with olive oil and wine, both which could be used to ward off infection. And then he bandages the wounds. He then places the man on his donkey and takes him to an inn and continues to care for him. The next day, the Samaritan leaves, but gives the innkeeper money to continue to care for the man, and even goes so far as to tell the innkeeper that should the victim's medical bill continue to grow, the Samaritan will pay when he comes back this way. The innkeeper could be considered the fifth character because he's to continue caring for the beaten man and to carry out the wishes of the Samaritan. At the end of the parable, Jesus asked the lawyer, "Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers?" The lawyer replied, "The one who showed mercy." Jesus then said, "You go and do likewise." The point is that the parable in Jesus' concluding question forced the lawyer to consider the nature of his neighborly activity. Jesus directs the lawyer to see neighborliness in the actions of the Samaritan, and not to speculate what might qualify a person to be considered someone else's neighbor. Jesus showed one cannot hate another human being and still claim to love God. Our love of God and man is best expressed in showing mercy to people in need. Let us show mercy wholeheartedly, and God will reward us with eternal life. If we are to be good neighbors, we need to be more like the Samaritan. Christianity is not about what I can do for Jesus, but in how I relate to him and my neighbor. The challenge of Jesus is to go and do likewise. We don't do it out of guilt or shame or as a moral performance, but because we have had the ultimate good Samaritan come to us on the road, and we will never be the same. Go and do likewise. When we learn this lesson, we and the world around us will be better. Some thoughts in regard to giving or showing mercy to others. Eternal life is an inheritance of God, reserved for those who love him. But we cannot say we love him if we refuse to show mercy to people. We can't show mercy unless we are willing to leave the comfort zone. We can't show mercy unless we're willing to sacrifice ourselves. Mercy is costly because everything in our society comes with a price. We will not count the cost if we truly want to show mercy. The Good Samaritan is an example for each of us. The Good Samaritan was willing to get involved. He had compassion and acted on it. The Good Samaritan ignored racism. The Good Samaritan had a good name. The innkeeper trusted him, maybe because he had proven himself trustworthy. The Good Samaritan was generous. The well-being of the stranger was more important than whatever the cost might be. The Good Samaritan uses his own supplies to cleanse the wounds and bandages them. The Good Samaritan uses his own animal to carry the victim, and the Samaritan walks. The Good Samaritan uses his own money to pay for the victim's care. The Good Samaritan uses his own reputation and credit to vouch for further expenses for the victim's care. Since all of you are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan, it might be fun to put this story in modern times. I found such an example written by Tony Nestor, a retired United Methodist minister. And here's a little of his version. Hopefully we don't offend anyone. A certain man went down the road traveling from point A to point B, And as it happened, he fell among some thieves who beat him terribly and then left him wounded and bleeding along the highway. And by chance, there came a charismatic Catholic and a Reformed Jew walking along that way. And when they saw him, they passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Bible-toting Baptist, a proud-to-be full gospel Pentecostal, a word-walking plain old Protestant, and even a couple of New Age Unitarian Universal Existentialists happened along while on their way to an interfaith community leaders conference. As each one in turn came upon the man and saw him lying helplessly in the way, all passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. Being on foot and without means to render aid, the Samaritan ran 2 miles to the nearest public telephone and hurriedly dialed 911. Because funding for the police, paramedic, and fire rescue services had all been drastically cut, being woefully understaffed, there was no unit available to send, especially not to such an out-of-way place. The emergency dispatcher immediately gave the sympathetic Samaritan a referral list of private ambulance companies to contact. One by one, the Samaritan called each of the ambulance companies, but all required a cash deposit prior to actual transport of the patient, which they would be happy to charge to the financially responsible party on any valid American Express, MasterCharge, or Visa card. In lieu of a cash deposit, only a limited number of health insurance plans were accepted, providing they could obtain prior authorization from the healthcare provider for ambulance services. And we'll leave it at that. So it is up to each of us to follow the lead of go and do likewise, as Jesus stated to the lawyer. Are we willing to do that? Thank you.